Yeah. Hello. Welcome, everyone. Welcome, everyone. My name is Mikkel Olesen, and I'm a senior researcher here at DIIS and one of the editors of the Danish Foreign Policy Review, and it's this one. We are very happy that you could all come today for our launch of the yearbook. It's a dual event today. On the one hand, we launch this review. On the other, we also wanted to take the opportunity of this occasion for a broader, more general discussion about the state of affairs of the world today, with a special emphasis on what it means for Denmark. Therefore, we have invited a number of esteemed speakers to help us get that discussion started. And please stay with us through it all. There are bubbles at the end. Now back to the yearbook. We are a new editorial team consisting of my good colleagues Cecilie Felicia Stockholm-Banke, Jessica Larsen, and myself. We are taking over from Hans Mouritzen, who's also here, who has been a driving force for the yearbook for many, many years. Hans, a big thank you for taking so good care of the yearbook for all these years. We know we have some big shoes to fill, and we will do our very best. Also, of course, the editorial team would like to thank everyone who has been involved in the process of getting it done. And that includes, of course, the authors, which are both academics and ministers. It includes our reviewers, our communications department, and as well as our editorial assistant, Samuel Berlin, who has been really great in helping us making everything happen, and he's down there. Yes. So, this year's edition has 6 articles. First, we have articles from the Minister of Foreign Affairs and the Minister of Defense. We have these articles every year, and the idea is that we ask the ministers to take stock of the year that have gone by, in this case 2023, and then write about what that has meant for Danish foreign and security policy. We are very happy that we've been able to do this every year for a number of years, and we hope and think that these articles can provide all of you with an interesting overview of how developments in the world today looks from a Danish official perspective. Then we have 4 academic articles this year, and I just want to start out with a few words about why these 4, how we get there. And our basic principle is that we look at the year that has gone by, again 2023, and then we look at the most important themes for Danish foreign policy that it could be interesting to have and relevant to have articles digging into. Often we use 2 different criteria for selecting themes, and this year, it was certainly the case this year, it can be articles dealing with events of importance for Danish foreign policy, with more or less within the year, but broadly understood, and it can be articles dealing with more sort of general trends in Danish foreign security and development policy, and where we simply believe that it's about to be due time for us to have a general article about this theme. It's also important to stress, of course, that each year we could write we could ask people to write articles about a lot of different themes. But we have the constraints of wanting to end up with a book like this, and not a book that's that looks like the Bible or something like that. So we have tried to limit ourselves to this year 4 articles, and the articles for this year, apart from the Minister of Foreign Affairs and the Minister of Defense, we have 4. 2 of these fall into the general category, falls into the category of dealing with important events or specific aspects of important events. First, we have an article from legal scholars from University of Copenhagen, Marc, Schack, and Astrid Kjeldgaard-Pedersen, who delve into the often missed legal aspects of supporting Ukraine in its war against Russia. Second, we have an article from historian Juhana Aunesluoma from the University of Helsinki, who examines the long road taken by Finland and Sweden to join NATO. This is another key event of great importance for security in the Nordic region, and not least for the possibility of Nordic security cooperation in the years to come. And the article provides an intriguing analysis of how these two countries came to shift their stand so quickly following the invasion of Ukraine, certainly giving up many decades, or in Sweden's case, centuries of non-alignment. Then we have, excuse me. Then we have two articles on the general trends in foreign security and development policy. We have an article from senior researchers, DIIS Senior researchers, Lars Engberg-Pedersen and Rasmus Hundsbæk-Pedersen, who look into the idea of pragmatic idealism in Danish development policy, with the very admirable goal of helping us understand what that means and what difference it makes in terms of Denmark, redefining its relationships towards many low and middle income countries in what is sometimes coined the global south. And finally, we have an article from Henrik Larsen from the Department of Political Science at the University of Copenhagen, who questions the continued relevance of discussing foreign policy activism. Foreign policy activism has long been a favorite term for the Danish IR community, but as for scholars, Danish scholars dealing with foreign and security policy, but what about Danish politicians? Do they even use it anymore? And he comes with some provocative and fine statements about, well, maybe they don't actually care that much about it compared to what we academics do. All of these 6 articles, these 4 and the 2 from the ministers, are extremely interesting, and I urge you, of course, to read them all. The Danish Foreign Policy Review is available on DIIS's webpage, and we also have a significant amount of print copies here today, so please feel free to, everyone, grab one of these for yourself before you leave. That concludes the first part of the event, the actual launch of this. As I mentioned, we now wanted to try something a bit different, and our idea is that given that the yearbook is meant to stimulate debate about Danish foreign and security policy in all shapes and sizes, we wanted to have also today a more general discussion about the state of affairs of Danish foreign and security policy today. And for this purpose, we have invited a lot of fine people. We have Kristian Søby Kristensen, center leader and senior researcher at the Department of Political Science, University of Copenhagen. We have Hans Mouritzen, senior researcher here at DIIS. We have Marlene Wind, professor at the Faculty of Law, University of Copenhagen. And to help us get, I can add something more of you.
No, I'm not from law. I'm also from law, but actually political science.
And political science. Apologies. And then to chair it all, this debate, we have asked Rebecca Adler-Nissen, professor at the Department of Political Science, University of Copenhagen, to help us steer through it all. So, without further ado, please, Rebecca, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, and I'll just off. Thank you so much. That's a wonderful day to celebrate the launch of this yearbook, and it is indeed a fine book with very interesting articles, all of them. In a sense, it's also an institution, and we'll try to go with that theme. I think we've been asked, or our panelists have been asked to answer relatively straightforward questions, but I don't think the answers will be straightforward, and hopefully they will generate some questions from you. The question is, what guides Danish foreign policy in the changing geopolitical reality seen from your respective research fields? So that's the Nordic countries, the EU and NATO / the United States. So each of our panelists will try to answer this question and more, I think. And the first that I'd like to welcome is Hans Mouritzen, who's a senior researcher here at DIIS, and I guess an institution in the institution of DIIS. So Hans, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Okay, thank you. Well, I was asked to talk about geopolitics in the Danish version, but thanks for letting me be part of the panel here. It has been nice to have this burden lifted of editing this so-called, in the old days it's called yearbook, but now I hear you start talking about yearbook again. But we changed the name because yearbook sounds so dull. So, but anyway, I think that looking at the articles this year, they are more mutually coordinated than they used to be. And that could be thanks to the new editors, but I'm not sure about that because I think it's more due to actual developments in the world, and by that, of course, I mean very much the Ukraine war, because all four articles. All four articles somehow pertain to that, as Mikkel mentioned, the legal aspects, NATO enlargement, military activism, the global south, and the war. So, but also not only actual developments, but also how these have been interpreted by Danish politicians. Because Danish foreign policy has become much more coherent, and I don't necessarily mean that in any positive way, but it all relates very much to the war in Ukraine. Sometimes even domestic politics, because if for instance the government wants to abolish a holiday, just as an example, then the argument that is that this is good to do because that will harm Putin. Or if the government wants us to work more, or at least not go down in working hours, it is said that this is good because in Russia they don't go home at 4 o'clock. So you can see how even domestic politics is becoming more and more coherent. Though not necessarily in a positive way, in my view. But as you know, our Foreign Minister Lars Løkke Rasmussen has launched a concept, pragmatic idealism, pragmatic idealism, that is discussed in Lars Engberg's and Rasmus Hundsbæk's article, and I can say a little bit about it here because it is one of the elements which makes things more coherent. In one of the too many plans and strategies for Danish foreign policy, they come too often, and thereby they need to be revised to say something new. The previous one, the Kofod plan. Or we could say the Frederiksen plan, if you understand what I mean. That was hånden på kogepladen in terms of blessing the world with our good values. The hand on the hot plate, according to the dictionary, to put it in English. So we shouldn't shy away from these difficult value things. But in Lars Løkke Rasmussen's new version, we should have more, as the name of it, we should be more pragmatic, but still somewhat idealistic, I guess. But that can be understood, Lars Løkke's concept can be understood in more than one way. Because in our bilateral relations to individual countries in the global south, it's allegedly important that we take them out of Putin's embrace, or the Chinese for that matter, and then get them over to the West and supporting the West. But in order to do that, we cannot point fingers at them. We cannot talk too much, or we cannot at all talk about good governance and that kinds of idealistic things. So no finger pointing, just like perhaps like a little China. They don't have that either. So perhaps we are imitating the Chinese here. So I have a picture for this which I called the Støvsuger model, and that is in English, of course, the vacuum cleaner model. And the assumption of the vacuum cleaner model is that the sum of good intentions or purposes is fairly constant. But what we do is that we take the vacuum cleaner, or we take the snake of the vacuum cleaner, and then we go to, for instance, Danish-Egypt relations and suck out the value promotion, suck out good governance, that kind of thing. We go to Danish-Rwanda relations, we suck out all the good governance intentions, and so on and so forth. Then after we have done that, we open the vacuum cleaner, and we open the dust bin, which is not a dust bin, which is filled with good intentions. And then we pour it all on Ukraine. See what I mean? So we suck the idealism out of bilateral relations between Denmark and the South, and then concentrate it on Ukraine. That's my interpretation. That is, of course, simplistic and maybe even controversial, but well, that's how I see it. We can discuss that perhaps. Of course, the Danish version of geopolitics has other aspects than the vacuum cleaner, but which I shall not go into here. But and of course, I know that other Western countries are doing some of the same. But I have not seen anywhere, perhaps some of you have, but I have not seen any Western country that has formulated it as explicitly as Lars Løkke Rasmussen has done. But apart from this little view of my own, I wish to congratulate the new editors with their first accomplishment, apart from the color, perhaps, which may be discussed. And I wish to congratulate also the contributors. I can see Henrik Larsen down there, and I think I saw Lars Engberg somewhere. There he is, yes. So congratulations to all of you, and I'll stop here.
Thank you, Hans. That got us started, I think. The vacuum cleaner model is now launched. And before we go into discussions with Hans, we'll simply pass the floor to the next speaker, who's my wonderful colleague, Marlene Wind, who needs perhaps no further introduction, but I'll do it anyway. She's director of the Center for European Politics at the Department of Political Science at the University of Copenhagen. And also, I looked, she hasn't been editing this review, but she has contributed with a chapter at least once, including one called The Blind, the Deaf and the Dumb, How Domestic Politics Turned the Danish Schengen Controversy into a Foreign Policy Crisis. Also a recommendable chapter, I should say. She's one of our foremost experts in EU politics, and that's exactly what she's going to speak about, namely Danish foreign policy and the EU. So the floor is yours, Marlene.
Thank you, Rebecca. Yeah, can you hear me? Can you hear me? No? Doesn't work, does it? Yeah. Okay, good. Great. Thank you so much for inviting me to come here today and to be part of this panel and contribute to this discussion. It's really wonderful. I will, and I have been asked to say a little bit about Danish foreign policy in relation to the EU. It's true that I was presented in the program as coming from the law department, which is a great honor because I'm also partly there as a professor and part of the I courts, and because I've now been presented as such, I have a little footnote in the end about also the Danish legal engagement in the EU, but. What I'm going to do today is that I'm going to divide my talk into 3 clusters. So the first one is about the ugly duckling that turned into a beautiful EU swan, and the second is the question about whether Denmark is still part of the frugals in the EU and has turned around there as well. And the final point is the Danish priorities with the council, president of the council next year. And just say a few things about what I've heard, at least that the Danish priorities will be. And of course conclude by asking whether we are really have turned around in our EU policy. So I think a lot of you in this room will probably know, have read in the newspapers, but also maybe been there physically a few years back when our Prime Minister, Mette Frederiksen, turned up at a big conference organized by Thank Europe, and saying that the European Union was berserk or gag. That's a few years ago now, and I must admit that sometimes I really have to find out whether I'm awake or not when I have watched from the outside the turnaround that we have seen by her in particular, but the entire government on its EU approach. I think that we really have seen a complete change of approach. And I think that it's not just superficial. I think it has some grounding, and I really increasingly believe that it's also not just spin. It's not just on the surface to get a top job or become popular in certain circles. Or I think that it's really a very genuine change in Danish EU policy, and that's why I think it's interesting. This year, the think tank Europe also invited Mette Frederiksen, and she actually, the first thing she said when she entered the States, it's not more than a month ago, was, before saying anything else, I have nothing critical to say about the EU. It was like this, and it was a very peculiar thing to start out a talk with, but nevertheless, it was quite interesting. So I really think that we have seen a change. And why do we have this change then? I think, of course, that the war, the illegal war, invasion of Russia in Ukraine, has turned Denmark into a hawk. It's sort of changed everything, I would say, in our EU policy, our approach, the way we talk about Europe, the rhetoric, but also the practical policies. It's interesting to follow in the coming years how far it will go, but I think we have to commend the government for having taken up the Danish opt-out on defense that happened a few years ago, and started with one quite important step to make Denmark part of the EU defense policies. The entire European Union, of course, has completely turned around. Also, I think the war in Ukraine has transformed fundamentally the European Union and has turned the European Union into a strategic actor. A lot of people laughed about this concept a few years back, but there Denmark is very present as well. And when you read the the Danish government's policy outline for the government, it talks about that all the time. So I think we are seeing some quite fundamental changes here. So the question is, of course, whether Denmark is moving into the core of the European Union. There's no doubt that the support for Ukraine and also the sanctions, the money for the weapons, Denmark bunching way above its weight in terms of being in the top 5 compared to other countries in its financial contributions to Ukraine. I heard Lars Løkke talk about this at Folkemødet last week, and he even said that why are we paying more? Because we believe in the cause. So it's quite impressive what has happened, I would say, and also surprising in many ways, looking back at how Denmark became a part of the European Union and has sort of communicated its EU policies over the years. So the question is, how far will we go in moving into the core of the European Union, and are we still frugal? So the question is interesting for many reasons. Some of you may know the analysis that comes out every 2 years from the European Council of Foreign Relations, showing that Denmark does not have very many friends in the EU, some people at least say that this is due to the fact that we have been in this frugal camp, and now the way the government talks about the European Union and money, there's no kind of nothing cannot be touched upon here. So there is no exclusion of Denmark raising its budgetary contributions. And there's also no exclusion of Denmark even signing up for a common depth when it comes to mobilizing money for Ukraine. So I think we have moved quite far from the frugal, and I think also formally Denmark has stepped out of the camp, and we don't have very many left in the camp, to be honest. Of course, a lot of things has to do also what has happened with what has happened in the Netherlands, but it goes very nicely, I think, with the rest of the policies that Denmark has contributed over the past few years. So very soon we will know also whether when we go down into the nitty-gritty, dirty details of the budget, whether Denmark will also be leading in terms of changing the agricultural policy and all the other reforms that we need in order to be ready to enlarge the European Union. So enlargement has certainly been one of Denmark's priorities, but we still don't know yet whether Denmark is actually willing to and also will be in the forefront arguing for these reforms that are needed. It's very little we know about that so far, and the official approach from the government is that don't talk about the war. They love to talk about the war, but let's not talk about the details of what this will require in terms of amending the treaties, changing the budget on the agriculture policy, regional policy, and so on. So that is still something we'll have to wait and see how progressive Denmark is, and whether we will actually end up in a situation where we will be encouraging everyone else to pay more into the budget, to take common depth, and to develop the European Union into a real defense union and strengthen the pillar, the European pillar in NATO. But the whole idea of strategic autonomy and of not being vulnerable was already in the government strategy when the current government was launched. So it's quite interesting to see that consistency, as Hans also suggested, is certainly there. Does it link up nicely with the activism, with the other aspects that the idea of a global legal order that should be protected, as Astrid and Marc also wrote about in this nice book? I think it is still the approach, also the pragmatism. I think can fit nicely into this category. So I think again the pragmatism actually is what Denmark has contributed all the time. Now we just put a name on it, but I think actually the pragmatism of a small state is really the policy we have followed. Just a final point about the council, the presidency, and maybe we can come a little bit deeper into that in the discussion. But I was really puzzled to hear both the head of the foreign ministry and also Lars Løkke talk about the implementation and how EU law was important for the EU presidency. I think that it's quite telling that Denmark is very focused on having a solid level playing field for its companies in the EU, and therefore see with some worry that the Commission has been taking on fewer and fewer infringement cases over the past 5 years. So that is something that Denmark wants to focus on to make sure that the level playing field on the internal market is really working. And then just one point, and I know I've crossed my time, just one small point about this. I spent a whole week in Luxembourg this spring visiting the court. I was invited. I had conversations with 8 judges at the court, and they were all quite puzzled that Denmark is so absent from the work going on in the court. For instance, big conferences about where should the European Union be moving in terms of its constitutional structure. Denmark has never been part of these conferences, has never shown up. So maybe we should look at foreign policy a little bit broader than just what we put into the council meetings and what we do in Brussels. EU foreign policy, in my opinion, is much broader. And by the way, it's also about attracting more Danes to the EU institutions. I think that should also be a priority. I know that the foreign ministry is already working on that, but I think we have to do much more. In a very, very few years, 40% of everyone working with a Danish background in the EU institution will be gone due to retirement. And I cannot see how we can defend our interest in the European Union if we are not present. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you to Marlene. And now we have a sense that maybe the vacuum cleaner has at least poured some idealism also over Brussels, or some pragmatism. We will know maybe in the Q&A. There's at least fruit for discussion. But our last panelist is Kristian Søby, who is director of the Center for Military Studies at the Department of Political Science at the University of Copenhagen. And he specializes in, which is very lucky because that's also what he's going to talk about, NATO and security and defense policies, as well as larger strategic discussions about transatlantic relationships. This is also why in the younger days he was called NATO Kristian. Now he is, or NATO Kristian. But he's also heading one of the most vibrant research communities that I know on this area. So, Kristian, very eager to hear what you have to say.
Well, thank you so much, Rebecca, for those kind words of introduction, but also thank you to DIIS for having me and being taped while standing so close to this institution, which was also an institution back in 2000 where I became a very young and interested intern at what was then called the Danish Institute for Danish Foreign Policy Institute. I've seen DUPI anyway, for those of you who are old enough to remember that. But also back in 2000 already, this was an institution. So thank you for allowing me to talk around the institution. So that my task is to talk about or give perspectives on NATO and the US in 9 minutes. So and the topic is of course bigger, but I think bigger than I can cover in 9 minutes. But I think I'll start out with what for me is a paradox, a big paradox in the sense that NATO is both strong, perhaps stronger than it has been for some time, and weaker at the same time. So the organization, the politics behind it are both solid, but they're also fragile. So let me start with the strong part of it, right? NATO, I think it's fair to argue, is strong, has shown strength, and is increasing its strength. You can point to different indicators, but let me point to some of them. For instance, we are watching a very, very substantial build-up of military force in Europe. It's about getting troops ready at the right time and at the right place. It's about making substantial long-term investment and investment pledges, but it's also about changing the organization, the command structure of NATO, making it more capable to do what the member states agree that it should do focus on, namely defense and deterrence of the transatlantic area. We are also seeing new members, both in terms of Sweden and Finland joining NATO, but there are also members standing on the outside, eager to be part of the organization, also an indication of strength, or at least attractiveness for European nations to join NATO. It has also, I think, shown a relative and perhaps even remarkable degree of consensus. There hasn't been that many who have sort of significantly left the ranks or played the part of a fundamental spoiler. So the organization is also actually able to act. And I think you could also see that during the first days and weeks of the Russian invasion back in 2022, where a lot of NATO's crisis management mechanisms actually worked. NATO could activate its plans. The North Atlantic Council worked. There was the political unity necessary to actually reassure NATO allies on the Eastern Front. Troops were moved. There was commands that could handle it. So the organization actually could use the Russian invasion of Ukraine as an opportunity to showcase that its own crisis management systems, which hadn't really been in use for a very long time, actually worked. Also an indication of strength. And underlining, of course, a lot of this has been competent and engaged American leadership. I think that is important to notice as well. So what are the consequences of those strengths? It is, on one hand, that I think we have seen Western strength and unity in response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and we have, at least my analysis, we have seen more than could be expected. I think to a certain extent the response of the West, of NATO, EU, has been remarkable, and I think it surprised many. I think it surprised Putin, but it also surprised a number of analysts, including me. So that is one consequence. Another thing is that is, of course, leads to what is most important in NATO, namely credibility. Right? On the one hand, being able to do this, being able to show all these activities, being able to point at those very indicators that I also just pointed at, underpins deterrence, right? Because deterrence is about credibility, that your opponent thinks that your threat is credible. But it also, on the other way around, it also enhances self-confidence, right? Being able to do all the things that NATO has shown that it has been able to do provides a certain self-confidence that we're actually able to do things. There is a purpose, there is a sense of unity, a sense of security in who we are and what we can do. And of course, that sense of unity also then works to reinforce the deterrence effects of NATO's strength. Right? So that is one part of the paradox, the strength part of the paradox. Because on the other hand, NATO is also in a sense weak. It has shown weakness and it risks becoming even weaker. Of course, first and foremost, this is commonsensically by everybody, I guess, at the moment, connected to the continued role of the United States. That produces an enormous amount of uncertainty to the organization. And I think this uncertainty both has a long-term and a short-term component to it. And of course, the short-term component is the upcoming US elections and what will happen if Trump gets elected, right? We have a very clear Biden path and a very uncertain Trump path for how US policy in general will develop, but especially on how its transatlantic policy will develop, all in relation to both NATO, to Europe, and Ukraine in particular. But compounding the short-term challenge or the short-term question about US continued support or the continued role of the United States in Europe is, of course, the long-term trend of US focus moving towards the Indo-Pacific. So that also needs to be considered in terms of gauging how and whether NATO will become stronger, will become weaker, how to manage this long-term transition, even if the transatlantic position of the Biden administration continues to dominate American foreign policy. But I think the point is that this sort of these indicators of weakness are bigger than what happens in the US. In a sense, they are also more broadly at play in Europe. And I've called the first one of them, I called not urbanization, but urbanization, right? In the sense that we can see a lot of the tendencies that have won power in Hungary and recently were had the governing majority in Poland and is sort of at play in the US, also is at play in a lot of other European countries. In Italy, France, Germany, the Netherlands, political forces with widely different views on how their states should do foreign policy and how they should do foreign policy together with other people is very different, and also the view on the support, continued support to Ukraine. So this urbanization or potential urbanization can lead either to a fragmentation of the European consensus that can lead to change policy, or perhaps even worse, no policy at all. And the point is that if we are indeed moving into a period of time where with a more withdrawn, unpredictable or indecisive US, the more important European unity and European potential for action actually becomes. Both for Europe, but I think also for providing the US with an actor, a European actor that the US can work together with. So I think the weakness is more than just the US. It's also about what happens in Europe. And one dimension of that is the urbanization of Europe. And the other one is a southeast divide. Because there is a very clear divide in Europe about threat perception that can lead to fragmentation. And I think that is really clearly shown when you look at the defense investments that NATO has just produced. On the one hand, we have Portugal, Italy, and Spain that are all between 1.5 and 1.2 of GDP used on the defense budget. And on the other hand, we have Poland on 4% and Estonia on 3.4% of GDP. And that, to me, is a clear underlining of the fact that there are very, very different European threat perceptions and also valuations of how threatened they are. And I think these things will play out in the NATO summit. It will, on the one hand, the upcoming NATO summit next week will, on one hand, showcase NATO's strength. A lot of talk will be about, look at all the military issues and all the military prowess and how we're building up armed forces. But on the other hand, there will also be debate about weaknesses, about burden sharing, about prioritizing between threats and challenges from east and south, and about locking in decisions trying to Trump-proof the alliance and the transatlantic relationship. So super quickly, what does this mean for Denmark? Well, of course, increased threats in the near abroad, combined with high uncertainty and questionable US credibility, is evidently bad news, right? So 3 things in relation to Danish policy. I think what we'll see, one thing is trying to Trump-proof even more issues, especially Ukraine, trying to lock in as large a possible consensus on maintaining support for Ukraine. And ironically enough, the means to do that are multilateralizing and institutionalizing, things that Trump is not especially pleased of. Then there will be a lot of dress up and a lot of window dressing, showing how both Denmark is punching above its weight, as Marlene said, and how Europe is also sharing its part of the burden and paying a lot of money to US defense industry in order to stand up for the Russian threat. And then we will see a lot of hedging that will focus on Germany, UK, but especially on the Nordic region as well. That's it for me. Thank you.
Yes, so now come to the part where you are also, in a sense, part of the discussion. So I welcome all 3 panelists, Hans and Marlene and Kristian, to join me. Given how much there is to discuss, and also the possible many questions, rather than me asking you a lot of questions, I'll open the floor, but I'll open it with a sort of opening question to the 3 of you. Now that you've heard each other, it seems to me that there's not entirely consensus on how to assess Danish foreign policy and its sort of predicaments. But if you were to take the 2 words, pragmatic, idealism, which seems to be the sort of, at least if you read the Minister of Foreign Affairs analysis, that is kind of the umbrella term for everything he thinks he's doing. How would you assess pragmatism versus idealism? Is what we see in the change around on European policy, is that mainly driven by idealism or pragmatism? Same for NATO discussions. And we sort of already heard Hans's version, but maybe now you've changed your mind, or maybe you want to phrase it differently. That's the question you can take with you. But I suggest, so basically the question is how much pragmatism, how much idealism, what's the mix? Or does the mix does it even make sense? Are we moving into what we might call a more existential phase of foreign policy, where these 2 terms lose their meaning because they actually become one, which would be my sense of what I hear you say. So you can't really distinguish anymore because it's about survival, which is a much more fundamental thing. Maybe that is not what you agree with. But what I would do is I'll collect a few questions and then we'll turn to the panel. So just raise your hand and please, if you can just briefly introduce yourself. Yes.
Thank you. Miłosz Kodes. I'm actually an external consultant at DIIS, and I just published a report on Kaliningrad Oblast, and one of my questions would be related to it. I have 2. One is to Marlene. Marlene, I sometimes use with my students when I teach them about international relations in Europe, I use this satirical cartoon when there is a bunch of birds flying next to a plane, and the plane is the EU, and there are some negotiations taking place, and the birds are actually Nordic countries. And they want to be a bit further away, but they still want to know what's going on the plane. So my question is, do you think that Denmark, out of these Nordic birds, it's already on the plane, and what seat it has taken in the plane, if it's already on the plane? Maybe it's just boarding the plane, and maybe it's already in the business class. and I wanted to know about this process from your perspective, or how do you see this process advancing maybe, and what are the limits of this process? And then the second question to Kristian, regarding my report. I mean, I was also looking at how the strategic situation around the Baltic Sea looks like from the perspective of Denmark, and looking at what's going on in Kaliningrad Oblast and how Russia has been using Kaliningrad Oblast in different ways. And one of the conclusions was, well, the main threat is that Russia has a huge potential for destruction. a very small potential for construction or for constructive actions, and this can take different forms in the area. Now I wonder, how do you think that Denmark should try to do as much as possible, not only to deter Russia, but also to minimize this threat coming from Kaliningrad Oblast, given everything that has happened in the area in the last 2 years with Nord Stream 2, with seabed infrastructure, with seabed explosives, with other islands in the area such as Gotland. I would really like to hear your take on that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'll take one more question and then we'll do a few rounds. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Severin. I'm the head of European office of Therma, so the Danish defense industry. So I live in Brussels and I spend all my time on EU and NATO relations. Obviously for Therma, we see a bit of this dilemma of, on the one hand, better playing the EU cards and at the same time keeping the relationship with the US and with NATO. So I guess my question is, from a Danish foreign policy perspective, how can we, on the one hand, protect or maintain the relationship with the US and at the same time being better European? What are the conditions to find this balance? Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So what I'll do is I'll simply start over here with Kristian, and then Hans, and then Marlene, and then we'll take more questions. So.
Yeah, no, thanks for your question. I think it's a great question, and of course, Kaliningrad has been sort of like a stone in the shoe for a long time, but nobody's really taken the time to get it out of the shoe, and now it sort of really shows its effects, right? In the sense that it's a node in a changing Baltic Sea security environment, I think, but where there's been a lot of talk about who has access and who has denial and who can sort of deny the other parts freedom of access. But I think the war in Ukraine, the naval part of the war, has shown that in a so congested area as the Baltic Sea, nobody can basically use the surface for any sort of military operations until you have won the air war. And winning the air war is also about neutralizing land-based missiles. So there's a lot of, both parties have a lot of denial opportunities in the region, and Kaliningrad is one of the nodes for that, of course. But that is the sort of the military sense, and I think you point also to the hybrid thing. I think it's the point is it's really difficult to deter. So I think that the most viable way ahead is try to deny as much as possible, and that's about having the right technology, focusing enough money on it, and working together about being present in the region. But on the other hand, I don't think one should overdo it, right? Because you sort of maybe a picture, and when in the playground, people can harass you, and hybrid attacks is harassment. Right, but harassment is not as the same as picking a fight, and I think those distinction also works in where to focus deterrence efforts. Deterrence efforts are most important in deterring Russia for picking a fight in the first place.
Okay. Mm? Hans?
No, I abstain.
You abstain. Okay. So, Marlene.
What about the pragmatism question? The idealism, pragmatism.
Yes, I would like to hear the.
Oh, okay.
Because I don't want to answer that, so that's why I'm asking you.
No, but I mean, I think I answered it in my talk. I mean, I'm just saying it's not a mix, as you say. It's more that all our good intentions and so on, and goodwill and altruism has been focused on one particular country. That was what the vacuum cleaner was doing.
Well, yes.
And another thing, and that is, now that I have the floor,
You have.
that has nothing to do with good intentions, but a field that has been come out of the picture since 2021. 22. That is the Arctic. The Arctic was coming up in 2008, 7-8 as an enormous topic, and then suddenly it disappeared in 2022 for some reason. That's a bit of a shame, I think, but that's just a side comment.
Well, I think the chapter in the not yearbook but review by the foreign minister underlines exactly the Arctic quite a lot. So yes, Marlene.
No, if I really am forced to say something about the pragmatism or to pretend I can answer, I think that actually this distinction follows very much from the EU's own security strategy. I think Denmark has copied to some degree at least. And I agree with Hans that the idealism is certainly showered over Ukraine. So it's very much an idealistic rhetoric that the government is using when it comes to Ukraine. But maybe it's at the end of the day it may be existential, right? But I think we see it there. As regards the pragmatism, I think that's exactly what the EU is also increasingly doing right now, because the European Union has found out that Jesus Christ, we are alone in the world. We are 8% of the world's population, and several of the big powers and countries in Africa and so on, they don't see what we see. So they are on a different planet than we are to a large degree, and that's where the pragmatism comes into the picture, right? So if you discover that. Running around in the entire world and telling everyone to respect women's rights and human rights, all of a sudden is no longer working, and we are at the same time in this war with Russia. I think that has forced us somehow to be a bit more pragmatic in terms of wanting to convey or convince African leaders and those in Asia and other places to support us in our fight. But I really, I'm also advising Josep Borrell in the foreign policy chief, and I remember him saying at a meeting that he just came back from Africa, that nobody understands us. We are alone, and I really think that is part of the reason why we have this idealism, pragmatism. So I think it's there. It was not a very good answer, but
I think the concept is strategically ambiguous. Let's put it that way.
Yes, exactly. Could I just answer the question on the Nordic countries?
Yes, please do.
Because it's really a wonderful cartoon you have been showing your students, or I didn't get who you were showing it to, but your students probably, or the talks you're giving. Are the Nordics on business class now, or are they still flying on the side? I think we are. It's such a new thing for the Nordic countries to all of a sudden having done this U-turn. Sweden and Finland, of course, mostly as regards NATO, but Denmark, it's certainly also our EU policies. And I think that it will still take quite a long time before you're allowed into the business class where all the others are. Also, we still have opt-outs, and we are simply not present in the institutions anymore. We are losing our influence by not having people in the positions in Brussels and in all the other bodies that we are part of, because it's not just Brussels, it's also Luxembourg, it's also Frankfurt, it's in so many places where Danish civil servants are not present. So I think if we should really seriously start broadening the idea of what foreign policy is. Foreign policy is not just about security and our narrow foreign policy goals. It's also about Danish interests being present in the institutions, taking part in the work that is going on in Luxembourg, in other places.
I'm going to
and
stop
I really think we have to think at a more fundamental level about these issues before entering the business class.
Thank you so much. As the chair, I'm aware of the time. I promised Kristian to say 2 words or maybe a sentence. And then I'll give the floor to Mikkel to wrap up. But
all right, just very short on
Yes.
on the pragmatism thing. I think when stuff is super important for Denmark, there will always be a combination of arguments, right? You could see the same in Afghanistan, where we were fighting for our own security and for Afghan girls' right to go to school. Right, so there's a mix of idealism and realism there. But I think the underlying assumption and the underlying argument is that Denmark is basically moving into a world where Danish and Western power counts for less, and at the same time a world that is much more competitive. The global Danish strategy 5 years ago was integration. Now the overall setting is about competition, and that makes your idealism much more pragmatic.
And on those, with those words, thank you to the panel, and give them a hand, and then we'll welcome Mikkel up here. Thank you so much.
Er vi allerede færdige?
Ja.
Jeg tror,
Okay.